name is Heather McGee, and this is the Happily Never After, a podcast that explores how life's endings can lead to a personal breakthrough. Because sometimes the end is just the beginning. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Happily Never After, a podcast where we explore how life's endings can lead to a new beginning. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to rate, review, and follow us wherever you are listening or watching the show today. Our guest today is Rebecca Miner. Rebecca is a queer clinician, educator, and gender specialist who works with trans and gender expansive youth and their families. She's the founder of Prism Therapy Collective and the author of Raising Trans Kids, What to Expect When You Weren't Expecting This. I have a copy of the book here. I've read it and it's incredibly helpful. I'm so happy to welcome you to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm really excited about this. Is something I've wanted to talk about on the show for a long time, and it took a while for me to find the right person. So I'm so glad that we connected. I think this will be a great conversation. Maybe we start with your book. Rebecca, can you talk a little bit about why did you write this book and what are you hoping to achieve with it?
Sure. I wrote Raising Trans Kids because I kept meeting parents who loved their kids deeply, but were terrified of getting it wrong or screwing it up in the process. Not because they didn't care, but because no one had ever given them a framework that actually made sense. So as a therapist, I had worked with queer and trans kids for, a decade prior to writing this book, and then shifted to working more with their parents and caregivers to really help close that gap. So it's about helping parents move from fear and confusion to trust and connection, because we know that the relationship is actually what matters most.
That's wonderful. Because I will say, in kind of getting ready for this episode, I don't think there's a lot out there that's helpful for parents, and I don't know, and you'll correct me because you are the expert on this. I kind of feel like more people are coming out as children and, talking about their gender expression or identity younger, whereas maybe in the past, maybe when we were growing up, a lot of people didn't feel comfortable or understand what was happening until they were much older. So it doesn't feel
Yes.
like there's a lot of guidance or support or even like known experience for parents to know what to do.
Yeah, and this is certainly not the first book that's been written like this, and there are resources out there, but I would say that on the whole, a lot of parents feel pretty lost and often very isolated in the process of trying to figure out how to support their kid.
And one thing I think that would be good to start with, because, I'm not going to assume that everybody knows what all these things mean. And I definitely learned a few things from reading your book. Let's level set on some definitions and what words mean, because I think a lot of people have the wrong idea. I certainly have at times. Firstly, can you talk about the idea that there are only two genders and why that is inaccurate?
Sure. So we were taught that there are only two genders, but that is most definitely an oversimplification and not actually a fact. So gender is a mix of identity. We often conflate it with biology, which is our sex, but it also includes our culture and our experiences. And so when kids say, this doesn't fit me, it's not that they're confused. They're noticing something real that our framework that's been simplified down to only two options doesn't account for. So it's actually a language issue. It's not that whether or not someone being trans is real, but that when we break down the idea of gender as only having two options, that doesn't give us an openness to understand that there's actually so much more than that. Not everyone identifies as either a man or a woman or a boy or a girl, that there's a whole expanse between those two, if you were to see them as ends of the spectrum. But in fact, there are people who probably, don't even exist on that spectrum.
And I think you make a good point too, because I didn't think about it that way, that sometimes the social constructs that we've set up, the words that we use, they're set up where this is what it is. And so when someone has feeling, understanding things about themselves, there's no word for it. So it feels like, oh, this isn't real. I'm making it up, which probably is a huge blocker for a lot of people as they grow.
Huge. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so for anyone who doesn't know, can you talk about what the term transgender means, what it encompasses, and then how do identities like two-spirit or intersex integrate here, if they do?
Sure. So transgender simply means that your gender identity, so how you experience yourself, your internal sense of who you are, doesn't align with your sex assigned at birth. So when the doctor said it's a boy or it's a girl, it's not anything more than that. It is not inherently political, nor is it particularly complicated. It's just a way of describing someone's lived experience that may be different from what we told them it should be. And how that plays into identities like Two Spirit is, frankly, Two Spirit folks were here and celebrating the expanse of gender far before we had the word transgender. So it's actually really important to uplift indigenous cultures, because really the construct we have around gender, this binary thinking, and I didn't want to dive in too much right at the first question on this, but because I
Here
was
we
like, oh,
are.
Rebecca, don't be too intense. But the reality is that this construct is because of colonialism. Um,
Yeah.
there were plenty of cultures that saw gender as far more expansive than only two options, but it was actually in the process of colonialism that we narrowed it down to only two choices. And so Two Spirit and there are, you know, many other cultures prior to that timeline who were uplifted and celebrated in their communities for being beyond such limited concept of gender. And so it really is actually a new idea, right? When people are like, everyone's coming out, it's this newfangled thing. That's actually not what's newfangled. What's new is the idea of trying to box people into only two options.
Yeah. Well, and you're making me think too. I had a guest on here recently, Esther Kim We were talking about reproductive health, and she is a bit of a historian, art history, and she talked about, that whole idea of the arc of history bends towards justice. She was like, kind of. She's like, but societies do roll back. Like it does absolutely happen, sometimes in a big, huge way. And so that was just kind of a good gut check. Like we all had this like faith it's going to always get better, but that's not. I mean, I would like to think that, but it doesn't seem to be borne by the historical events that we know about.
Right.
I hate to say. Okay, so you ask a question that you in your book that I think is really interesting. How does the binary limit us? And we kind of hit this
Mm,
a little bit, but I would love to talk about that because I'm real passionate about that too. Like binary thinking, black and white thinking, which is something I did a lot growing up in church. And as I grew up, I was like, this like doesn't work. It doesn't like if it's this, but then there's all this other stuff that I guess I'm organized. Like, what box does it go in? Because it doesn't fit in here.
yes. Yeah. So, right, the binary doesn't just, and I'm glad you appreciated that chapter. I wanted to point out to people that, binary thinking is so much more than just the gender binary. And it's
Yeah,
also deeply embedded in our language. Is how we talk about things like, rock bottom. Like we have all these terms and kind of phrases in English, especially, that really highlight like these polarities. And
yeah,
I want people to think about the fact that binary thinking doesn't just limit trans kids, it limits all of us. Right. When it
yeah,
comes to gender, it tells boys there's only one way to be a boy and girls there's only one way to be a girl, and anything outside of that is wrong. And so then when a trans or non-binary kid pushes against that, they're actually showing us how restrictive that system has always been.
yeah,
But I think it's incredibly destabilizing because when we think about gender, it's one of the earliest pieces of knowledge that gets repeated over and over again, right? If you think about like being in preschool or kindergarten, it's like, okay, boys over here, girls over here, like we line up this way. There are two genders. And we often teach kids that they are that gender because they have particular body parts, which is also a
right.
great failing on our part because that's not actually how that works. Right? Gender
Yeah,
and sex are separate. It is true that many girls have certain parts and many boys have certain parts, but it's not
yeah,
always the case. But my point around this is that when we tell people, hey, that's actually not true, there are more than two
yeah,
genders, it's incredibly destabilizing because it's one of the earliest truths that we have kind of collectively agreed upon. And
yeah,
so when then that isn't true, it's like, well, what else isn't true? And that's all very scary and unsettling. And so it feels easier to just be like, no, like this is what I've always known.
Right.
and to stick with that black and white thinking.
This is a bit of an esoteric question, but something that I've been thinking about is, like there's no such thing as male colors or female colors. Like everyone can wear pink,
Mhm.
everyone can wear dresses, everyone can wear makeup. I like to wear pants on occasion
Yeah,
and
I love pants,
hairstyles. And yes, pants are great. Um, but it
especially
just
if they
makes
have
me think
pockets.
about like, yeah, I do wonder if the idea of gender may go away or significantly change because it's like, what are we even talking about? Like, there's no such thing as the way people are supposed to act or
Right.
who they're supposed, and then going into like orientation. Like, all these things are way more fluid and expansive than I think most of us were taught. And it
Mhm.
does make me think about like, is there even such a thing as a, I've been struggling lately with like, what do you mean a girl or boy? Like, it's just like
Yes.
you are who you are. And it's way more expansive in my mind. But maybe that's the wrong way to think about it. So I'd love to hear your take.
I don't think that's the wrong way to think about it. I think I see this work as really being about generational change because I think
Okay.
that's where the shift is going to happen is that the more we have children who have freedom to choose and explore, the more we're going to have authentic people who will then raise kids like that beyond them. And
Yeah.
my hope is that there will be less like rigidity around girls do this and boys do this. Because the reality
Yeah.
is, when I talk with adults about what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a man, there is no consensus, right?
Yeah.
Because they
What is
are
that? Yeah, what would an
constructs.
answer be? Yeah.
Well, they're not all that compelling. And so I actually have an exercise that I do with folks that's called the Gender Identity Challenge. Oh, and it was in the book,
Mhm.
and it really asks that question of like, how do you know what is your gender, and how do you know you are that gender? But you can't use any anatomical language. So you can't say, I know I'm a
Okay.
woman because I have these parts. And you can't
Right.
say, I know I'm a man because I'm one of the guys, right? Or gendered terminology.
Yeah.
And it baffles people time and time again because we depend on those things to make sense of our genders. And so
Right.
people will start to say, well, I know I'm a woman because I'm a mother. And it's like, okay, well, can only women mother? And not all women can have babies, and not all women want to have babies, right? So that falls flat pretty quickly. There are plenty of trans men who have babies. Like, that's again
Yeah.
an anatomical piece that doesn't make, so that's not it either. And the more you dig
Right.
into it, it falls flat.
Yeah. I don't think I would even know how to answer that question. Like,
Most
I'm
people
thinking
don't.
about it right now, and it's like, I don't think I have an answer because everything I come up with is like, well, I don't think that means you're I don't think that means what some people think it means.
Exactly.
I really don't think I would know personally how to answer that question for myself.
And that to me is the biggest takeaway of that is like, how are we going to simultaneously not allow certain people in to a group when we can't even define the group in the first place, right? Like,
Right.
what do you mean she's not a real woman? What is a real woman?
Yeah. I don't
And
I don't have an answer for that. I
yeah,
really don't.
and if for most people's answer, it's like, well, I just know. And so, fine, then if that's the answer, then we need to accept that answer from everyone.
Yeah, I was just thinking about it now. It's like, well, I guess I would. It's like you were saying, I just feel like I am. It's like, well, I guess I feel like I'm a woman, but like I don't have any evidence for them. Like I'm like, I don't think I really care to be honest.
Right.
But you were talking about generational change earlier, and something that there's a lot going on. A lot of people that are in any kind of marginalized group is not feeling real great right now.
Hmm.
So that is definitely going on. I don't want to act like it's not because it absolutely is. And it's impacting pretty much everyone at this point. I saw, you're gonna laugh, on TikTok. I saw a video recently that I thought was really beautiful. And I'd never thought about this before in terms of generational change. There was a mom in a car and her two like elementary school kids in the back. Someone said something like, oh, my friend, essentially saying my friend is gay. And the
Hmm.
parent was like, oh, well, did they come out to you? And the kids in the back were like, what do you mean? What's coming out? Like they were very like, why would they come out? I'm just telling you that's who their girlfriend is.
Right. Right.
And I thought it was so beautiful and made me think about, I was like, because I think when we were growing up, that was something you did. Like people
Oh,
assume the
yeah.
default and then you came out. And I'm even seeing it with my own children. Nobody does that,
Right.
among my kids groups. They're just like, oh, they'll like tell me like how to address certain kids in their friend
Mhm.
group, or things like that. And I'm like, okay, thank you for telling me. But there was no coming out. Like they're just
Right.
who they are and they let you know.
Right.
So, one thing that I think it looks like from your book, and like I see it just as a civilian myself, the question of, well, when can you know? How do you know that perhaps you are gender expansive? When the kids in the families that you work with start to understand that their gender may be more expansive or fluid, about what age do you see that start to happen? Because I think a lot of parents, with good intentions, they're not sure how to take it because their kid might be very young saying these things.
Absolutely. My article that I wrote that gets me the most hate mail is about
That's when you know you've made it. When you're getting a
exactly.
lot of hate mail, it's like, "Oh, I
Yes.
feel good about that
Yes,
opinion. It
which
hit."
I actually keep as a folder and I call it my fan mail. Um,
Mhm.
um, right, we need a
I like
positive
that.
reframe. Um, but is about this very subject because people really get hung up on kids being too young to know. Right. And there's this idea
Yeah.
that like we're pushing this on children and that it's dangerous and it's not okay. The reality is, and there's plenty of research that supports this, that kids actually know this really early. They start to understand their gender as young as 2 or 3. And trans kids can often know that something, and that's for all kids, right?
Yeah.
And trans kids often know that something doesn't feel right about that, perhaps around that same time. What changes over time isn't their identity, it's their ability to explain it. So
Okay.
sometimes kids articulate from very, very young, right? I've worked with families who do have a 3-year-old who say, I'm a boy or I'm a girl or like, I don't like this or that. And they are able to articulate it. Other people, I mean, I've worked with people across the lifespan who have then said, I knew when I was 5, but I didn't come out till I was 37 or whatever. There are
Yeah.
also people who don't come out until puberty. That's another big time that we see a
Okay.
significant onset because when the body starts to change, it becomes so much more evident that for some people, it feels like their body's then betraying them or is no longer in alignment. Because until
Yeah.
puberty, kids are kind of the same, generally speaking,
Yeah.
right? When it comes to bodies, like
Yes.
until we get those secondary sex characteristics, besides your private parts, like there's
Yeah.
not much else that differentiates you. But when you start having facial hair come in or you start growing a chest, those things can then feel suddenly very dysphoric. Um, and so we
Yeah.
see an
Well, I wanted
onset
to
then.
ask well, and I wanted to ask you, so sorry for interrupting,
That's
but
okay.
I wanted to ask you about that. Like body dysmorphia, because this is kind of what I wonder. I'm going to ask you like all the questions I wanted to know from someone who actually knows the answers. Um, so, in terms of body dysphoria, and gender, some people do decide when they're adults to make changes to their body for one reason or another, medically, surgically, hormones, all of those things. What is your recommendation on how to approach that messaging to people? Because I do see quite often people will respond with like, they assume that those things are going to happen, but you don't have to do that to be transgender. Like some people choose to do that, but you don't have to. How do you think
Absolutely.
about or talk about the body dysmorphia that can happen when kids do hit puberty and how they feel about it?
Yeah. So one key thing I just want to touch on and not
Okay.
what you've said is exactly what people say all the time. So there's a difference between
Okay.
dysmorphia and dysphoria. So
Okay.
dysmorphia is a sense of size. So that's when we tend to see our shape
Okay.
and weight as dramatically different than it is.
Oh, okay.
Dysphoria is what we tend to see among and people can have both for sure.
Yeah.
But the words get flipped all the time. So it's great that you said it because now we can highlight it. Dysphoria is that sense of like this doesn't feel right. Like when I look in the mirror,
Yeah.
what I'm seeing reflected back at me does not feel like me. Um, and or, having these body parts change in this way just doesn't feel like the body I'm supposed to be in. And so for some people, that is something that they choose to change in some way, and some people never do. And so when we talk about
Yeah.
gender affirming care, the way it gets talked about in the news is like everyone's handing out surgeries to children and they're all taking hormones and they're doing these experimental drugs and all of this is happening when in reality for some people, gender affirmation is just maybe changing their name or getting a haircut, maybe changing, getting some new clothes. And those are things we call a social transition versus a medical
Yeah.
transition, which would include things like hormones and any potential surgeries like that, which again aren't happening to children. No one is performing
Right.
surgery on children, nor are
Yeah.
we typically medicating children. This is all happening at the onset of puberty or later.
This is such an interesting conversation to me because I think topics like this, some people, when faced with new information, they don't want to hear it or accept it. And then,
Mhm.
that's kind of like when you know someone has just made a decision, they have these beliefs, and it doesn't matter what the truth is. Um, and this is one of those subjects where it happens, where you might tell someone, I understand, I hear you that that is your feeling and belief, but I can share the truth with you and it
Mhm.
just gets dismissed, even though it is the truth. And it doesn't matter how many American medical associations have confirmed this, how many studies, all of those things. That
Yes.
doesn't matter. It's just someone bringing in the beliefs that they want to hold on to, regardless of what the truth and the facts are.
Yes. That's really what I spend most of my life doing, actually. Yeah.
I bet.
Yeah.
Wow, you must have such a strong, patience muscle at this point. And one thing that that I have learned, and this is something that I do happen to know about, even though I'm just a regular person, people do have that misinformation about what gender affirming care can mean for minors.
Yes.
Things like, that whenever you hear in the news, and you hear it a lot, like experimental medicine. It's not experimental medicine. This is the same medicine that is used on children all across the country and the world that have other issues like needing
Mhm.
growth hormone or,
Mhm.
treating, they're not experimental. They are not new. This is just a use case. And so,
Exactly.
just in case you think that, I would like to slash that belief. And then the other one is when we hear about puberty blockers, again, that's a practice that is used for kids with a variety of issues. It is a pause button. It is not permanent. A child is not committing themselves to anything with puberty blockers. It is just a pause that is fully reversible. I do want to
Mhm.
say that because I think a lot of people have the wrong idea about it and they use that as their reason to deny these things to children who need it.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled that you said it because and you said it in almost the exact same way that I always say it.
Okay, good.
Um, so truly, I am thrilled that you brought it up because people don't understand that. And of course, then when you hear it in the news, it does sound scary, right? Like if you're like, oh my goodness, they're
Yeah.
using experimental drugs on children and they're performing these surgeries, like
Right.
that would be really concerning.
None of
But
it.
the reality is these
Yeah.
medications are used all the time. In fact, you listening may benefit from the use of hormones or other forms of gender affirming care. Like if you've ever
Yeah.
had hair removal or
Right.
or take
Yep.
Viagra or have ever had a cancer treatment or fertility treatment, all of these, like so many of
Right.
our parts of medicine rely on a lot of these same drugs and also various types of gender affirming care.
Yeah, my hope is that one day, but of course you can't get someone who's not willing to consider this to do that. But my hope is that at some point, more people will realize that their beliefs are really predicated on their own bias and discrimination and does not have a foothold in the truth or the data or the facts
Wouldn't that
that
be
are
nice?
black and white laid out there with science behind it. What is your advice for parents that there is concern about their trans child? That the focus is the fact that they're trans and not that they love volleyball or drawing or music or they have all these other hobbies because it can become because of the way society treats them, that's like the main thing when that's a part of their identity, but that is just one piece of it. What do you
Mhm.
do to say to parents that maybe want to try to protect their child from that happening, or what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's that we just want to let kids be kids. And I think trying
Yeah,
to remember, like you were saying, all the other things that they love to do and the things that make up who they are so much more important really than their gender.
yeah, right. Yeah, I think about things like kids that want to play and this subject has been focused on in the media and used as a political pawn to a degree that I find frustrating. The idea of trans kids being able to play sports.
Oh, yeah.
Sports where they're not getting paid, like it's just very silly to me.
Mhm.
Like that's what I think about. Like a kid who wants to play volleyball, and then as a parent, if the school is not going to let that happen, like how do you say to your kid, they're not going to let you because they don't like who you are? You can't say that. How do parents have those kinds of conversations? Because the kids may be innocent to how some of the world views them at this point.
I think it's a difficult question because there's so much nuance to it in that it depends on the
Yeah.
age of the kid, it depends on where they live, it depends on how much they're already exposed to or not. I think
Right.
if they're a really little kid, how you frame that is going to be completely different than like a junior in high school who's planning on, playing a much
Yeah.
more competitive sport. Um, and I think
Right.
every family is going to kind of err in different ways, but I think the general way of handling it is that, there are people who still have really limited beliefs around who we are and how we can all live. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, that sometimes results in people seeing things as unfair. And
Yeah.
we know that it's unfair for you to not be able to play. It's not that it's unfair because you have an advantage.
Right. Yeah. Especially when in the situation where everyone's just doing it for fun anyway. So what's the big deal?
It's and that's
Like, whatever
where,
problem they have, like, doesn't even exist.
right.
Okay, so one thing that this kinda leads me to a broader question of, and I live in Chicago. I actually have a number of kids in my life, in my personal community circle who are trans, gender fluid, or gender expansive. Um, and so they live in a world where it's not a big deal. Everyone's very fine with it. No one has anything negative to say. Or they don't experience exclusion. Even at school, I think when you live in a city, especially on the northern side of the country, it's more likely for you to have this experience. But
Mhm.
the adults in the room know that there's a point where they're not going to be so innocent, and this ease of them being able to be themselves is going to become more complicated at a certain point. What is
Yeah.
your advice for parents in terms of having those conversations and preparing them for that while not taking away their joy at being who they are?
I think, again, kind of similar to what I had said, I think there's so much nuance there because it also depends on the other ways in which they might be multiply marginalized. Um,
Right.
right? This is a conversation that comes up a lot with particularly white parents who are like, should we have this
Mhm.
conversation with our kids? And I think if you talk to parents of color, they would say, we've had to have hard conversations with our kids since they were really young
Yeah.
about what it's like to
Yeah.
move through the world as a person of color and whether or not you can actually trust the police or feel safe in these different environments. And so I think there's some inherent privilege to also like reckon with in some of those
Yeah.
questions. Um, and I think it's that constant balance of like, how much can we let them just be a kid and how much do I have a responsibility to kind of like a duty to warn um, about how scary things can be. And I think while they're still young and living under your roof, I think in many ways it's not helpful for them to know some of the extent of what's going on. The reality is kids have access to the internet. Um, and
Yeah.
they will find things out. So to me, it's less about necessarily sitting them down to say, here are the bills that aren't passing, and here's like the scary truth about anti trans legislation, as much
Yeah.
as right? As much as keeping an open line of communication and saying, if you ever see things that are concerning or confusing or upsetting to you, I hope you'll come to me and we can talk about it. Um, and I think
Yeah.
you can name that there are hard and scary things happening, but you don't necessarily have to go into the depth or detail that I think, parents may be consuming and often are the news with
Yeah.
a level of concern that we really want to protect kids from.
Being a mom is a huge teacher, I think. Being a parent is a huge teacher, courtesy your children. But something that was a big lesson I learned, it was my default to feel like, "Oh, my kids don't care what I say." I'm like, I'm just like their mom, I'm whoever. And it has become clear to me, especially as my kids grow, they care so much about what you think. And if you make an offhand comment, it can be devastating to them and you might not even know. And
Mhm.
so I've just learned to be even more careful with the way I talk. Like if I make a joke, that I think is innocuous and not a big deal, later I realized they took that to heart. Or something I
Yes.
said months ago that I thought was small. I find out later they're still thinking about it. And so I think I want to put that out there in case anyone hasn't realized that our kids care about what we say and how we act so much.
Yes. And those offhand things are important to be aware of, right? Because sometimes we just say
Yeah.
things and you don't know that they stick.
Yeah. What are some practical tips that you think parents should, or pillars that they should think about to do their best to create an environment where your kids feel comfortable communicating with you about things like this? Like I work really hard not to set a default. Like when they were younger, I didn't ever say boyfriend, girlfriend, anything like that because I didn't want them to get the idea that there was a right answer.
Mhm.
But what's some of your advice for how parents can create as welcoming, safe of an environment for your kids to talk to you about things?
I think you gave a great example right then of just, by us not making any assumptions about who they'll be and who they'll love, it gives room for them to share the fullness of who they are more freely. Um, I think also sometimes it's not about necessarily what we say to our kids as much as what we show them too. So, you know, exposing them to community where, not every family looks just like yours. And,
Yeah,
telling them whether that can be in person would be great. If not, making sure that they're exposed to media or books or stories that highlight all kinds of different people so that, they may not necessarily be able to say, Mom, I know this about myself, but maybe to be like, oh, interesting, that character kind of feels like me. Maybe that's something about me, or it opens up a line of communication to say, like, how that girl in that book felt about this. Sometimes I feel that way too. And so it kind of opens the
yeah,
door to have some of those conversations. I think continuing to create opportunities for exploration and exposure are the best way to do it. And then also simply naming, like, I am in your corner and you are not going to scare me or, upset me by sharing things with me. I would rather, like, it's so important to me that we can be honest and open with each other. Um, I think one thing that uh, got kind of shared a lot or people will say a lot is like, I love you no matter what. And I
oh,
think
yeah,
there's actually a tricky linguistic piece to that in that it feels like I will love you even if you are
oh,
trans or
yeah,
even if you are right.
yeah,
And we actually don't want to give that messaging that I will love you despite that truth, but instead
yeah.
I will love all of you.
That is such a great piece of advice because I didn't think about that, and you're so right. Now I think about it, it's so obvious.
Right. Right. But we
Yeah,
don't think about it and it's something that just gets said and you think that's a nice sentiment, right? I love you no matter what.
right.
Um,
Yeah,
but it gives the idea that I love you even if you, are breaking the norms in this way or if if you do this thing that doesn't quite fit. Um,
yeah.
yeah.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question that's about a pretty serious topic. I will say, trigger warning to anyone listening, about harming yourself. So
Mm,
say that. So dip out if that doesn't sound workable for you. One thing that I feel confident saying this, that a lot of parents of trans kids think about trans kids and adults are at much higher risk of harming themselves,
mhm.
perhaps permanently, and ending their own lives. What is your advice, A, to help parents do as much as they can to prevent that. Um, But how do you manage that with your child? Obviously, you don't want this to give them that idea, but we all know the very clear data and statistics on that, and it is a big worry, especially when they grow up and they're out in the world and you're not right there all the time.
Mhm.
How do you guide parents in their thinking about that? And then is there anything they can do to help make their kids safer on that front?
So the reality is that those statistics are real, but the statistics that don't get as much airtime are that it only takes one affirming adult to reduce suicidality risk by 50%. So, yes, trans youth have a risk of self-harm and suicidality that is 4 times the national average, but if they have an affirming adult in their life, that is dramatically reduced. And so I think it's important that not only do we acknowledge that there is risk and concern, but that we don't stay stuck in a persistent state of like, oh my goodness, my kid is going to hurt themselves, because I don't think that's helpful to anyone. And the biggest protective factor is you, the parent, not doing anything special necessarily, not, there isn't like a secret to how to make your kid not self-harm. The secret
Yeah.
is showing up and loving your kid and staying in connection and relationship with them, right? It's so much less about what you say, but how you continue to show up. And
I
so I
so
think,
appreciate that.
yeah, yeah, no, I was going to say, I think it's this very scary thing for parents. And, if you Google trans youth or you start to just look things up, unfortunately, a lot of what you find is focused on so many of the risks,
Yeah.
and not nearly enough about the joy and the strength and the stories of getting to see your kid really flourish, and feel at home in their own skin in a way that you'd never seen them before, and make friends and do activities, and that is those are the stories that I want more people to be exposed to.
I really appreciate you because when I was writing this question down, I was like, oh, I wonder if there's an answer for this. Like, that was a real, true, like, sometimes I ask questions I just think we should talk about. But this was one of them. I was like, I hope there's an answer for this. So,
Yeah.
because sometimes they're not. So I was like,
Yeah.
well, you just got to be careful. So I appreciate you coming in with something that I think everybody can do,
Yep.
support and affirm your child. And that makes such a big difference in those scary, because, yeah, you don't hear that part. You just hear the scary
No.
part that's terrifying.
And that, I think, is the takeaway for parents around this in general is like, yes, it's helpful to learn the language. It's helpful to learn some of the realities of gender affirming care. It's important that
Yeah.
you do some of that homework to support your kid. But at the end of the
Right.
day, like, the overarching thing is to continue to love your kid and be in relationship with them. And all parents know how to do that, regardless of your kid's gender.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, just
Really,
because
it's all
they're
the same thing.
transitioning.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. That is such a good reminder. I like how you connected that in because, sometimes trans parents are, or parents of trans children are, I think,
I know
kind
there's
of held
never an easy
hostage
way
a
to
little
say
bit.
that.
I know. I was like, this is the clunky way to say. Yeah.
I know.
But parents of trans kids, sometimes I think parents feel a little bit held hostage by their fears, which I think can probably transfer to your kids, even though you don't want to do that, obviously.
Absolutely.
Um, but you're right. Every kid should be supportive, and the whole definition of that, no matter who the kid is and what they have going on, which can be a whole array of things, not just
Hmm.
being trans, but other kids with other things that they need support on. And you're also making me think of an experience that I had with some parents that are in my community. Because as I mentioned, I'm in the city. Like, there's actually a fair number of gender expansive kids in
Hmm.
our community. And there was this one couple, and we were at like a dinner, and they had just started getting doing appointments to learn about gender affirming care.
Sure.
Um, because they are about to start puberty. And so they just wanted to like find out more. It was like an info session. The father was saying things like, I just, is this a phase? Is this real? I'm scared to move into gender affirming care because what
Hmm.
if in a few years they change their mind? And the doctor was like, well, first of all, they can do that with the puberty blockers because it does nothing permanent. So I hope that allays your worries there. If that
Hmm.
he said that doesn't happen very often, but if it did, there's no issue because you just
Right.
stop the puberty blockers and then, everything goes back to what it was before. But the other thing he said, you didn't bring this up, but I'm just going to share this. I know there's a lot of concerns about puberty blockers. I hope I've allayed your concerns about that it's not as anything that is risky. But I just want to say out loud, there's also a risk, a bigger one of doing nothing and not supporting your child. That's actually the one you should be more worried about. And I just
Yes.
appreciate that so much because it really clarified. And just from hearing you talk, I feel like that's the theme. That's like the number
Hmm.
one thing you can do for your kid.
Hmm. Absolutely. And right, we think so much about all the risks of acting, but there's a risk in not acting too, right? And that is still a
Yeah.
choice.
Yeah. Yeah. Choosing to do things is a choice, but then also not choosing to do things is also a choice. And I think sometimes people are more inclined to take a default of doing nothing.
Hmm.
But I think we would all probably in general live better, more effective lives if we realize you're making a choice either way. So think about it that way, and
Absolutely.
maybe that will inform what you do or don't do.
Right.
So in your practice, you've worked with so many families. What are the big things that you see that trans kids wish their parents understood?
I think one of the big ones is how painful it is to feel like you've finally figured out who you are and to share that with your parents and have and be met with grief.
Oh, yeah.
Um and the like, you're just going to have to give me time because I've lost my child or something. And
Yeah.
the reality is there's a place separate from your child for parents to process their feelings, some of which
Yeah.
may be grief or grief adjacent, but it's not helpful to share that with your kid, right? When they've finally gotten the courage to tell you who they are, to then be met with like feels like I've made my mom really sad by telling her this.
Yeah.
Um, that is not helpful. I think also the idea again of like that inaction of like the let's wait till you're 18 is also a choice of not doing something. And we
Yeah.
know that waiting does not tend to help. And not to say that you should, dive right in and that like the day your kid comes out, you should take them to see a doctor and start making medical changes. Like that is not what I'm saying. But I think
Right.
to really, when parents don't really listen to what their kid's going through, um, or listen but don't want to hear.
This is another thing I've learned as a mom, and I do hear about, like looking at society in the macro sense. I think for a long time, the prevailing parenting was pretty prescriptive. This is what you will do. You will go to college and get an engineering or accounting degree. You will do this. You will be that. You will wear pants. You will do this, like very prescriptive. And I
Hmm.
think over the generations, especially recently, I think there's been more and more parents that are not so prescriptive and they're kind of
Yeah.
moving to a support position, theme of the day, of creating the space and supporting their kid. And I put it as trusting your kid. Your kid's not
Yes.
dumb, and they are expressing something that is true, especially for, true about their experience, true about their feelings. And anytime you tell them, well, that's not correct, that's not right, that's taking the
Right.
prescriptive route. But then you cut off. I mean, you're also teaching the kid not to listen to their own instincts, not to listen to their own brain, and just do what others tell them to do,
Hmm.
which I think does not serve anyone.
Absolutely.
All right, as we're closing up, I have one final question. It's a question I ask everybody. Sometimes you get real funny questions, and sometimes you get really profound ones. In life, what do you know for sure?
Not much. I think if anything, this work has taught me that we have to get comfortable with uncertainty.
Yeah, yeah. I call it. We all need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and I feel like
Hmm.
that's really the key to a pretty vibrant life where you learn lots of things, you get really curious. Yeah, that's how you go from, if you always believe you don't know much, I think you can kind of move through life learning and collecting
Yes.
experiences and growing in a way that you cut yourself off if you are prescribing a belief system to yourself.
Absolutely.
Now, Rebecca, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today and also your book, which I will hold up again. And I will also link in the show notes. Where can people find you if they want to work with you or hear more from you?
Sure. The best place to find me is genderspecialist.com or gender.specialist on Instagram.
All right, great. And I follow Rebecca on Instagram and she shares all kinds of like micro tips, guidance, and advice there. But her book is really it's exhaustive, not meaning tired. I mean it like covers all of the areas. And I think you did a really good job of highlighting things that I think sometimes parents are embarrassed to admit they feel like
Hmm.
being uncertain, like being like on their heels a little bit and not knowing what to do. And she has some assessments and quizzes in there that are really helpful. But I'm going to link a lot of resources for you all from Rebecca in the show notes. So you don't have to remember anything or scribble it down. You can just go there and link out if you want to learn more from Rebecca. I want to thank all of you who are listening today, especially those of you who are on your own journey. So happy that you are here and learning with us. We hope you had a great week.